Okay, it is week 6. It's 8:30 p.m. and we are moving pretty fast in this quarter. As you can see, you've got all of your assignments all graded up to date. I am working on week 5 as we speak now, and looks like most of you are doing pretty good. So keep up the good work, keep moving forward. It would be nice though if you guys came to the lectures, because then we could interact more. But at any rate, I will continue to do them. So let's start out by sharing my screen. And here it is. You can see our week 6 announcement. Crimes involving public health and safety, chapters 11 and 12 of criminal law and procedure, Shive and Shive, and the activity offenses against public order and health. And then also you have your discussion post, which is the USA Patriot Act, which is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, and then your reply post by Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And again, I encourage you to respond to as many posts as you can. It makes the discussion forum flow better, and it allows you to exchange comments between each other as well. Finally, your written assignment is criminal liability for corporate officers, and then of course your quiz. I do recommend that most of you do your quiz at the end of the week so that you will be helped to make sure that you maximize the grades that you get, because there's no midterm or final exam in this course. So your quizzes take the place of those. And then also I want to say to you that that material that I send you, that outline, it has a lot of information concerning terms, because this course is full of terms. You'll discover in law that there's a lot of terms, and then how you apply them is very, 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 very important. And so that's what we deal with. So the quiz. And then I remind you of my motto: adversity is a springboard to success. I also encourage you, if you need additional course information, to please do this. I do have to keep saying this. Not often students are not conducting research. Most of you are conducting research. But if you don't, you'll lose 2 points. But what most of you are doing, if there are some issues, is in your written assignments regarding the APA format, it is very, 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 very important that you get an understanding that satisfying that requirement requires citations in the body of the paper. Now, it shouldn't be just one citation thrown in. It should be citations throughout the paper to provide information to the reader as to where you got those statements that you make. And then 2, your references at the end. It's not one or the other. And most of the time, students are guilty of not including citations in the body, but includes references at the end. I keep stressing over and over, you're going to lose points every single time. With the written assignments, you're going to lose at least 3 points. And then with your projects, which we won't have any until I think week 8 now again, but at any rate, you'll lose a total of 5 points. So you want to make sure that you get those in. Very, 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 very important. So with that being said, let's take a look at the course calendar. And it lays out again what the assignments are. We are, this week, there's your reading assignment, there's your discussion assignment, indicating your lecture tonight, your reply post Saturday, your written assignment that I just discussed, and then your quiz. And so remember that the next lecture will be the 23rd. And after the 23rd, which will be week 8, we will have just one more lecture to go, and that'll be week 10. So the quarter's moving pretty fast. So now let's take a look at our module before we get into the lecture. Let's look at the assignments. Again, here are the facts that you're involved with. Make sure that your paper is 2 to 3 pages. Not 1 page, not 1.5, but 2 to 3 pages. The cover page and the reference page does not count. And make sure that you run your papers through Grammarly, which most of you have done a good job of that, to make sure that you are not just copying and pasting, taking sources and information without adding your own thoughts or critical thinking. Very, very, very important that you submit it. And repeating the facts does not help any, because I want to more see how you handle the issues in writing these assignments. But again, I already referred to the fact that the APA requirements are that you provide citations in the body of the paper, and that you reference it at the end, that you conduct some research. Using the textbook is not adequate. You want to also conduct research. We got a lot of resources that we have been providing for you. And then your discussion post, the topic of the U.S. Patriot Act, and making sure that you answer these questions, and then make sure that you break them down into detail, and then finally your quiz. And those are the assignments for the week. Now let's look at the lesson content. So we're going to deal with public health issues and crimes against public safety. Again, these are the assignments for the week. Reading 11 and 12, which, by the way, you should have the PowerPoint and additional material by now. I sent that to you on Sunday. And then your written assignment, your discussion post, and your quiz. So let's take a look very briefly at offenses against public health. And then public health, why do we have it? To protect society. It's the law that gives power to it on the federal level is Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, the Commerce Clause. And it's the law that allows, it's the section of statute that allows, such as the Patriot Act, wiretapping, Clean Air Acts, and gives power and authority to the FDCA, which is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and it talks about dealing with your food and drugs and cosmetics, making sure that they're not too adulterated. They do allow a certain percentage, but can't go beyond that. Then it talks about strict liability, and under the FDCA, the defendant is strictly liable for crime, even though they didn't intend to do it, because it's a strict liability crime. In other words, no intent or mens rea is required. Corporate officers are held responsible for the actions of the company, and the courts had some issues with corporate representatives, but if the representative has the ability to prevent or correct the illegal activity would fail to do so, they could be held liable. And some corporate representatives, it says, have challenged these under the Fourth Amendment unlawful searches, but they haven't been very successful. So the bottom line is that the public health is heavier and greater because it says that the substantial harm that may take place outweighs the individual rights. So the corporate representatives who may be committing fraud or various acts to the public is held to a high standard. And then there's some recent developments talking about secondhand smoke, which we've discovered that, you know, there's a lot of public buildings now that don't allow smoking. I remember years ago you could smoke in the clubs, the bars, and restaurants, and they had a non-smoking section, but now all the public buildings now pretty much have banned those, which it makes sense because I always had a lot of trouble as a non-smoker being in a place where there was smoking that took place, because even though I was in a non-smoking area, it would still invade my space. And then the other thing regarding the issue of secondhand smoke, it's been proven statistically and scientifically that individuals who don't smoke are subjected to greater danger than those who smoke from secondhand smoke. So that's merely breathing in the smoke of other individuals who are smokers. And then finally, we talk about September 11th, 2001, when the Patriot Act came about, and, you know, the coming down of the World Trade Centers and the Patriot Act, some challenges on the Fourth Amendment rights, but it is because of the times that we're in now, as you are well aware, that terrorist attacks are more frequent now than ever before. When I was a kid coming up, the closest terrorist attacks that I knew of that hit American soil was Pearl Harbor. But now we have reached a stage where we've had several instances, from the Oklahoma City bombing to the bombing in the Boston Marathon, and then the biggie that September 11th. You know, so the bottom line is that we're in a different world now. There are all kinds of instances where terrorist activity is taking place. So then finally, there's a little game here that you can go through, and you can answer the questions, and it will help you to do this. So you just have to type in the information or what it is. A person who holds a supervisory position in an organization may be subject to criminal liability and liability for regulatory offenses, and that's one across. So you already know the answer to that, so you would type that information in, okay? Then you keep going, okay? So that's it from that. So now let's get back into and start with our lecture now. And we're going to go as far as we can to 10 o'clock. Whatever we haven't covered at 10, I will be cutting off. I used to go beyond that, but I'm not doing that anymore. Okay, so anyway, offenses against public health and the environment is the first section that we're going to cover, chapter 11. And the Industrial Revolution it talks about is when it became necessary for us to recognize that the public needed to be protected, and that in order for us to be healthy, we have to have a healthy environment, and such as littering, noise ordinances, anti-smoking laws, and littering can be from the standpoint of throwing trash into the water, other things that affect the water, because just remember one thing, we don't get any more water. The water we have now is all we're going to have, and we have to be good stewards and take care of it, because water is critical to life. most of your body is made of water. And so as a result, it's very important that you get to a point. Now, there are some people who say, oh, we got bottled water. Bottled water comes from hopefully the mountains where most places are. But the fact of the matter is that it still comes from the water resources that we have available. And if we're contaminating them, then we are ingesting those into our body. We are also allowing the plants to be watered, and the water plants get it in the roots, and then it becomes part of the plant, and then we eat this. And so the same thing with the animals. They eat the grass, or they eat the grain, or whatever they eat. If it's damaged, then it creates problems there. So the bottom line is that we have to recognize that the law has to protect us. And as I said earlier, Article 1, Section 8, generally is the way that this takes place. Now, there are regulatory agencies such as the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and then there are on state levels, and then there are usually also federal levels. And again, I pointed out that they are usually strict liability crimes. And we won't spend a lot of time going on that, but the bottom line is that they're mala prohibita, which means they're just prohibited on their face. And it means also the fact that there is no necessity for intentionality. And it's just based on the commission of the act itself. If you're the person responsible, whether you're a corporate person, if it's a corporation or a company, if it's an individual, then if you do it, you're going to be held strictly liable, not that you were not aware of the law. State versus Bud says it's a criminal offense to dispose of garbage in a ditch, pond, or stream. We talked about that before. You know, one of the things that really irritates me is I've seen people throw their bags of garbage off of vehicles and throw them into bodies of water, and just to dispose of it. It's just crazy. I've seen people dump, even now, you know, your old televisions, computers, and things like that. You can't just drop them anywhere because they have to be specifically recycled in a proper way to protect our resources of the soil and the land. And so the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, as earlier I said, prohibits trafficking in food, drugs, and cosmetics that are prepared under unsanitary conditions that would create injury. Oftentimes you'll discover recalls that take place because they find foreign objects, they find metal, they find E. coli, they find other kinds of filth and things. So we're going to protect the consumer and set the standards. And also, you have to be able to recognize that if a product says that it is something, that the product shouldn't be branded to be otherwise. I'll give you an example, and the one I like to use all the time is juice blends. If you see juice blend or juice drink, that is not 100% juice. But if you see juice and it says 100% juice, then it must be 100% juice. I was sharing with my wife one time at the store. I says, notice the cranberry juice. I says, they got a cranberry juice cocktail, which is a blend. But if you have cranberry juice and it says 100% on there, then it has to be 100%. And if it's determined otherwise, then it's misbranded, and there can be fines under the violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Same thing with drugs. They must be they must contain, and you also have to now, you'll discover that drugs also, almost every time you go get a prescription, you get a little sheet that comes with it. that tells you the side effects, and it tells you what those drugs are, and then gives you maybe the name of it from the standpoint of a generic as well as a company name. So the point of the matter is that the government, through the FDA, Federal Food and Drug Administration, utilizing the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, regulates that activity. Coca-Cola, here's an example. Some people didn't know this, is that, Coke is what we always called it. And the reason why is because in an earlier time, in the 50s, Coca-Cola contained cocaine. It actually contained cocaine. And then Coca-Cola was forced to remove the cocaine and replaced it with caffeine. But it went over to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court determined that the amount of caffeine that was included in Coca-Cola was very addictive and that they needed to reduce it. So Coca-Cola agreed to reduce the amount in a compromise. So the point of the matter is that there's all kinds of regulations. There's a question down at the bottom posited about these energy drinks. I don't drink them. Like Monster and Red Bull. And one of the problems that I have seen is individuals who drink these, they have a tendency, their heart rate increases. And I have seen people who go into cardiac arrest and have heart attacks. And I've seen younger people have heart attacks and go into cardiac arrest from drinking these energy drinks. And so as a result, there's a question about whether or not they should regulate them. I'll tell you about another drink that, for example, Mountain Dew. There's an old saying that, when it first came out, the shout out was Yahoo, Mountain Dew. Well, one of the reasons why that would take place is because there was even more caffeine in Mountain Dew. It's one of the most caffeinated drinks that you're going to find, more than some coffees. And it really contains a whole lot of that and a lot of sugar. So there are some health issues too that now the government is starting to crack down on to regulate because of the health problems that have resulted from ingesting those drinks. So there is a question about regulation of Red Bull, Monster, and some other drinks that are along those same lines as well. Same thing with that energy, I forget what it's called, the little container of energy where people just scarf it down. It's like a powdery thing. Same thing. We always have strict liability. And oftentimes, if they're really not very serious, they're misdemeanors. But in terms of if there's a felony liability involved, then specific intent has to be proven. And some people state that the violation should not be strict liability crimes, such as if it labels people as criminals who are without moral fault. Well, here's the key. You're criminals because you violate the law. And the law says it is a crime to do such and such a thing. And when you do that, you commit a crime. And what is a person known as commits a crime? Criminals. So as a result, it says not a moral fault. Well, I have to disagree with that because that means that that person is neglecting or being negligent in terms of looking at the health benefits in the form of favor of profits. So there are some arguments on both sides, and it will continue on. Zoning ordinances, this time generally has to do with land, real estate, where there's certain kinds of buildings that can be in certain areas. Almost every municipality has zoning ordinances, and they're usually enforced by the zoning boards of the agents of the area, whether it's a city, a county, and there's not a whole lot of state zoning boards, but Most of the time, it's in city and a county, and they're enforced by civil courts where there's orders that prohibit certain buildings from being in certain places. Most of these violations are misdemeanor, but intent is not required. It's just simply that, for example, if you build a fence and those kind of things, and it is not the right kind of fence, then you can violate a zoning issue there as well as probably property boundary issues. Environmental laws, I already said the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, enables Congress to protect the environment. And then the EPA, I told you, in 1899, the Rivers and Harbors Act made the misdemeanor discharge garbage or any kind into navigable waters. Why is that? Because it traveled through multiple jurisdictions. Go back. Okay, this is a case which I won't spend a lot of time with, which went always to the Supreme Court, and it said that the government could prosecute those who discharge refuse into navigable waters. That's what that case stood for. Then the Clean Air Act, again, goes back to Article 1, Section 8, which gives the authority for being able to do so, and it sets the standards for clean air. As many of you know, that your local organizations, such as the states and local governments, generally enforce those. For example, you have emissions tests based upon the age of the cars, the vehicles that you have, and they must satisfy those because that has to do with the clean air. Once again, the air being polluted, it creates health issues in individuals, and so as a result, the federal government and state governments will enforce them. There are also sanctions for falsifying documents. So let's say, for example, if a person does something to change the odometer in a vehicle, because the odometer is important in determining the age of that vehicle, but also how much use it's been. And the point of the matter is that the more you use the vehicle, the more it's going to be, how should I say, letting out emissions into the air. The point of the matter is that you have to make sure that you satisfy the standards. I remember years ago when I was a kid, you used unleaded, not used leaded gasoline. Now we don't have that around. It's all unleaded, and now you got the E85, the kind. I have a HHR, and I can use that in that vehicle. That's supposed to be even cleaner. And then there's ethyl included into it, supposedly to clean the engines, which results in cleaner air as a result of that. Clean Water Act, same thing, deals with the pollution into navigable waters. Navigable waters are only relatively permanent standing bodies of water, prohibits discharge at any point from any sources at all. And the courts will hold high standards to supervisors. And I already kind of hinted to you about corporate liability and responsibility for things that involve dealing with the clean water. We're going to talk about one in just a minute here. Here it is right here. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the great oil spill that took place down in the Gulf of Mexico, in which oil flowed from BP for 3 months after an explosion and killed some people and injured others. And then the spill created extensive damage to the marine life and to the wildlife and destroyed the beaches. Well, BP was sentenced to pay $4.5 million in fines. Now, there could have been some other consequences depending on the intentionality of it. Let's say, for example, if it came as an explosion, but let's say it was dumping. If dumping, then we might have some criminal liability. But the fact of the matter is that $4.5 million in fines is nothing to this company for dealing with that. But the fact of the matter is that because of the damage that was caused to the loss of the beaches and to the natural resources, the animals, the fish, and other marine life, they had to pay a fine. So what I'm showing you, this is an example of how the government can enforce violations of polluting the water. The Resource and Conservation and Recovery Act sets out regulations for hazardous waste. You know, people dumping all kinds of things on the side of the road, as I said, in water, but there are fines, and sometimes, depending on the seriousness of the actions or the purposeness of, can go to jail for up to 5 years. And states set the standards that are laid out under the act itself. And illegal actions include transporting hazardous waste to unpermitted facilities. Again, as I said, making sure that that waste is dumped in the proper place. Imagine this, a company like Waste Management, Root, and some other, Republic. These are some big companies that I'm familiar with. They have to have a special place to dump their hazardous waste because it can create health hazards and even death. They have to store and dispose of hazardous waste with a permit. And if it's done so without a permit, people can go to jail. Omitting material information or making a false statement, lying, can result in going to jail and or a big fine as well. The Toxic Substance Control Act prohibits the manufacture, distribution, use of chemicals that present unreasonable risk to the environment and to regulate disposal. So, in other words, let's say, for example, if a company, a drug manufacturing company, is dumping into the water, and the chemicals that they use to make the drug, that's going to be a problem. And generally, it could be civil, but it is possible at a certain level when it becomes pretty rapid to prosecute a person criminally, as this is an example, Robert Earl Ward Jr. Criminal liability of corporations, we've kind of talked about that. Food, drugs, and cosmetics are produced by companies, corporations. Corporations are individuals, and corporations are actually considered as people. Now, not human beings, but they're considered as a entity, but it is run by the corporate officers and the board of directors. So corporate officers, which could be the presidents and so forth and so on, the CEOs, CFOs, and the board of directors themselves can be held accountable if they don't supervise production and distribution. Misbranding of food due to lack of control mechanisms, as I've talked about earlier. In the United States versus Park, Park failed to use his authority in operating a company to prevent food storage in contaminated places. So the bottom line is that, you know, I have seen situations where there was one restaurant which I was told that that it's a buffet place, put their meats sometimes in places where it's not cold because they run out of space, and then they'll take those and then cook those, and then, you know, people can get sick from that and poison. Well, if that's discovered that they did it intentionally, then the corporate people of the company, if they're aware of it or should be aware of it, all the way to the managers are held responsible for that. So there's criminal liability that extends to corporations. So you have to be careful if you hold a board membership in companies. The Doteridge case, 43, said that corporate officers can be held criminally liable for the acts of the corporation. In this case, this company purchased drugs from various pharmaceutical manufacturers and put their own labels on it. This was considered misbranding. The Supreme Court upheld a conviction arguing that Doteridge was responsible for preventing the public from being endangered because the public was deceived about the actual drugs. Noise pollution, this is a whole other issue. In 1978, under the same Article 1, Section 8, Commerce Clause, Congress passed the Quiet Communities Act, which details and prohibits certain acts of punishment. Now, what happened is states and local governments are responsible for protecting communities against noise pollution. For example, in an apartment, they may prohibit the use of loud audio equipment so that you don't disturb other people. You may hear people driving down the street sometimes, and they have their music so loud, you can actually get a citation in most municipalities for doing that because it's noise pollution. So the Supreme Court has held that ordinances have to provide requisite cure notice and adequate warning of the conduct. So you can be aware, though, of the fact that if you are blasting your music out loud, you don't have to know the specifics of it. But here's the deal. You should be aware of the fact that if your music is going beyond your car, and that you're probably violating some ordinance somewhere. And then the other thing is that if you are, for example, having some event, a party or something, and then it's late in the evening, there are times when you have to tone that down because that's the time people will rest. So anyway, noise pollution is regulated as well. Anti-smoking laws, we've kind of talked about that. Restricted smoking in public buildings, places of public accommodations and transportation. We already know airplanes, buses, and of course schools of all places. And you know, at our college, in our campus, they used to have a smoking section outside, but now they don't even have that. You're not supposed to smoke on the grounds of the college. And a lot of colleges have moved in that direction. Florida enacted laws prohibiting smoking in restaurants and other public places, with the exception of standalone bars. Punishments, though, are fines. I know a lot of waitresses and bartenders and people that worked in these places were happy when the laws changed. But I can tell you this, that I discovered something. I was in Vegas in September of 2015, and I was shocked to no end that all of those places you could smoke. These people are gambling and smoking. Walking through the casinos, you just have to, I mean, for me it was bad. I couldn't stay in there long at all because of the smoking. So they have, in Vegas, allow that. So I don't know if that's in other cities in Nevada, but I can tell you that in Vegas, in those clubs, in those casinos, there is smoking. Then it talks about New York, some examples. New York, comprehensive smoking ban, may not smoke in places of employment, areas of bars, restaurants, subways. And the bottom line is where the public is going to be involved. And then there's a question about the future of smoking bans. Laws are becoming more restrictive. There's been some attacks by or attacks on non-smoking regulations, saying that they violate the Equal Protection Clause and that smokers have rights and due process and the right of privacy. But they fail. They will fail every time because the health benefits of clean air will outweigh any argument that a smoker can have. You will not be able to. You probably have noticed now that many people have gone to these electric cigarettes. You will see also now noticing there are more and more prohibitions, even with those as well in public places. Wildlife. We, conservation people, I have a few students who always want to be conservation officers. Usually we're talking students that are in Minnesota or Wisconsin, but some of my other states, but those are the two main ones, maybe North Dakota. But the main ones I run into are Minnesota and Wisconsin. But the state protects by wildlife by regulating fishing. You have to have a fishing license. You have a certain amount of fish you can catch. And then, you know, there are public and private streams that are controlled. And then the Migration Bird Act protects certain species of migratory birds from hunting. For example, you do know that you cannot ever violate the federal law if you shoot and kill or hurt a bald eagle. The bald eagle is highly protected. But there are other birds that are protected because of the seasons, for example. And violation is typically a misdemeanor. However, you can find yourself, if you're going to be making profit from that, with a felony. But I would say to you that probably, and I haven't looked at it, that under Chapter 18, United States Code, which contains all of the criminal code of the United States on the federal level, probably there is a felony conviction for shooting, killing, or taking the life of a bald eagle. Don't do it. Endangered Species Act is designed to make sure that we have certain species that still continue. Because, see, our whole system of life is based on the animals and the plants and all working together. And the ecosystems, that's what I'm talking about, the wildlife, the fish, the plants eat the fish, and I mean the fish eat the plants rather, or wildlife eat the plants and things like that, and it just goes around in a complete cycle. But there are criminal penalties when a person knowingly violates these regulations. And protected species such as nesting sea turtles. Also, in the next slide, whale hunting is one where whales are an endangered species, especially in Alaska and those areas. In the North Pole, whales were hunted for their oil because it's used for heating and cooking and other things, and used for the food, the blubber, also clothing and other products. And it reached the point where with technology, it was easier to catch the whales and were killed. So in 1946, International Convention for Regulation on Whaling came about. But it's important to protect our endangered species and wildlife, again, back to the eco-balance that we have. All animals play a role, and if you become a student of wildlife or animals, you'll discover the reasons for that. Okay, and that's it for this chapter. Okay, so now let's shift and go to offenses against public order, safety, and national security. And so now we're moving away from the resources. We're moving now more towards protecting individuals themselves. The government has the obligation, it says, protect the public under utilizing the law. and the security of the nation, using the military forces, intelligence agencies such as Homeland Security, CIA, FBI, and it goes on and on. Firearms, the DEA, there's another one. Anyway, but the fact of the matter is that these different agencies are here to protect us on the federal level. You will have also in states some of these type of agencies that operate as well. But the government and the federal government has the responsibility. Now, under common law, this is before statutes, cases that were decided that crimes against public order included breach of the peace, inciting a riot, disorderly conduct, and violation of noise ordinances. Now, usually what happens is that these codified later on, and almost every jurisdiction has codes that specifically list the crimes or charges. But for example, if 3 or more people met together with the intention of cooperating to disturb the public peace, it was considered unlawful assembly. Those laws have been changed a whole lot because of the First Amendment, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the point of the matter is that under common law, if a person took steps to achieve their plan, it was considered a rout. And if they executed their plan, then it became a riot. So then we got into the conspiracy issues, which we won't spend a lot of time talking about today. Breaches of peace under the local, federal, and state law rest on the, as I said, state and local governments. Their ordinances prohibit unlawful assemblies and riots, disorderly conduct. Again, the key thing is to keep order in the community. That's the key. Sometimes there's a conflict between keeping the peace and the First Amendment. For example, right to free speech and assembly may be restricted only where necessary to achieve a compelling government interest. So here's the key. It's a real high standard that must be met. The key is generally to allow free speech, even if you don't agree with the position that that person is taking, but there are regulations and rules about the times that people should do these things. They sometimes, depending on the circumstances, have to get permits, but if it involves a religious entity, almost every time when you try to implement laws to stop them, as long as the activity doesn't present a public danger, a public health danger, then the religious clause of the Constitution is going to prevail. We'll run across some of that. In the United States Supreme Court versus Grace, the Supreme Court stated that the First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly can't be restricted on the sidewalk in front of the Supreme Court because the sidewalk is not part of the court. And so this is something that's interesting because there have been marches before that in front of the Supreme Court. And I know well about it because I was involved in some of those marches when I was in law school. But this lady, Mary Grace, had been told by the police that according to a federal statute, she could not hold up her sign displaying the text of the First Amendment on the sidewalk. The statute was declared unconstitutional because the First Amendment right of that person to express themselves in an orderly fashion should not be restricted. So it didn't interfere with the court. The Federal Anti-Riot Act prescribes interstate travel and use of the mail, telephone, telegraphs, radio, television with intent, now internet, emails, and all that stuff to encourage or participate in or carry on a riot. That's how people sometimes get caught in violations because it's very easy now because the fact that we have the World Wide Web to distribute the information. Then in that case, if it is inciting or a riot or committing violence in furtherance of a riot, people can be arrested. And that happens a lot with terrorists. That's what the Patriot Act does. But the act was challenged for vagueness. In 1972, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, which is the circuit that I am located in here in Illinois, held that the Anti-Riot Act is not unconstitutionally vague. So the point of the matter is that, and the reason why that happened is because there were marches. The weathermen, which had nothing to do with the weather, there was massive riots and marches that took place in downtown Chicago. I was working down there at that time, and that's what led to this Seventh Circuit ruling that went, I think, all the way up to the Supreme Court. The fact of the matter is that the Federal Anti-Riot Act is constitutional and is still the law. And now, in this case, Edwards versus South Carolina, the Supreme Court reversed the conviction of some African American students who were told to disperse, but they were arrested. And the court argued that the students were peacefully expressing their opinions, and the Fourth Amendment does not permit the state to make criminal the peaceful expression of unpopular views. That's what I was saying earlier. Even if you don't agree with it, the Klan, for example, has been allowed to march in the Black community, the Hispanic community. They have allowed to go into the Jewish community. The same thing with the Nazis and so forth and so on. However, though, those individuals usually make sure they get permits, and the reason they get the permits is not to control them, but to make sure that the locality, the municipality, village is or city is aware to provide adequate protection for those individuals and try to keep things as orderly as possible, because inevitably protesters are going to show up. As we're in an age right now where protests are a regular part of the day. An example here is Occupy Wall Street. Movement started in September 17, 2011, which protests the social and economic inequality and the perceived undue influence of financial and other corporations. And they showed where the people were gathered. The police forced out of the individuals out of the park, and the FBI and DHS and Department of Homeland Security monitored this as a terrorist threat. Again, remember, this was after September 11th. So all these kinds of things they look at. The police had barricades, and the protesters created problems, and many of them were arrested. The key thing is when there's confrontations, then you're going to run into some problems for breach of the peace. Vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws go way back, and it just simply meant that a person didn't have a means of support, not employed, and being able to work but refusing to do so. In the 1800s, the states defined it in a number of ways. But by the 50s, these laws changed and pretty much applied to, as it said, alcoholics and other derelicts, individuals who were down and out and who were just sleeping on the streets, homeless people. In 1972, though, the Supreme Court ruled the statutes were vague, but most states continued their practices against homeless and alcoholics for years. So the point of the matter is that the vagueness of the statutes caused modification and changes, and the goal was to try to put these people out of sight of the public, because they a lot of communities, such as, for example, down in Florida, there were people who were homeless being fed, and the people who were feeding the homeless people, religious organizations, were even the pastors or people were locked up and charged with crimes. And they were using these vagrancy laws, and still exist now. It's kind of bad because with the economy being as it is now, there's a lot of people who find themselves in that situation. In 1972, the Papa Christou case versus the city of Jacksonville, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that the vagrancy statute was so vague that it led to arbitrary arrest. The person had been convicted for violating a Jacksonville vagrancy ordinance, and it was too vague. Bottom line was, it was so broad that it was catching people and just violating the constitutional rights of those individuals. Loitering. Now, after this case, the states began to change the laws to make them more specific, and the laws then began to focus on preventing crimes such as prostitution. I remember in Illinois, which in Chicago specifically, there were loitering laws, and we're going to talk about one in a few minutes, that enacted to not control loitering per se, but to try to use it as a way to combating the gangs. Well, many of them were held to be vague, and that the loitering laws, as I said, must focus on conduct, not the status of an individual, such as if you're an alcoholic or something like that. Homeless people in Florida is a violation to overnight in public places. That's part and parcel of what I said a few minutes ago about feeding people. And how come? Because people go to Florida and they retire and they have their wealth and they don't want to see this. That's the reason. And it's not right, I don't think, on an ethical level or moral level, but that's the basis for it. Now, here's one I was talking about, City of Chicago versus Morales. Now, this was an attempt by the City of Chicago to have an ordinance to deal with gang congregation. What happened is that the city enacted the ordinance, said that police officers could arrest anyone they reasonably believed to be a gang member or loitering in a public place. And the point of the matter is that the court said, I know what you're trying to do, but that this is not the best way to do it. So we want you to come with something more specific. But anyway, so then they start coming back with the statement of known gang members. So it was the same kind of thing. The courts argued that the ordinance was unconstitutional because it did not specify that the person had to be doing something other than just be known as a gang member, and prohibited, therefore, failed to give ordinary citizens adequate notice. So the bottom line was that it was ruled as unconstitutional. And it gets back to the point then, the First Amendment rights of the individuals were protected, even though the city was trying to use it not for the average person, but to deal with gang activity, and they said that's not adequate. Panhandling, it goes back to what I was talking about before. Papa Christou versus City of Jacksonville, vagrancy laws regularly included people who were begging. Well, after the court invalidated those laws, cities enacted new ordinances, and that's why I keep telling you, against begging, which are called panhandling. The Supreme Court has yet to take up these yet, and so there's going to be a continuous battle. But I will say to you that the more the economy goes down and people are unemployed, losing their homes, and all of those different things, the ability to be able to live, you're going to have more of this kind of thing, and they're going to end up in the courts. Motor vehicle violations, strict liability violations. You know, I mean, I didn't know the speed limit was this or that, yielding the right of way, wearing a seatbelt, texting while driving. If you violate them, then you're liable, strict liability. There's no knowledge necessary. I had a person one time when I was the village attorney in a town that they were speed limit, let's say, for example, I'll give you 30 miles an hour, and the person was stopped and they were ticketed, and then they came to court and they were ticketed at doing 35. And they came and they said, Your Honor, yes, I was doing 35, but what about the 5-mile rule over the speed limit? There's no such thing. People think that it is, but there is no such thing. The law is the law, okay? And if you're like 1 mile over, then you might be, but there's arguments, you know, when it's that close. But when you come in and you admit it, then you've already solved the prosecution's case already. You've convicted yourself. In the 1980s, rules of the road made traffic rules uniform across the states, but there's still some differences, such as the speed limit in various states and jurisdictions. Decriminalizing traffic offenses. Until the 60s, most offenses were misdemeanors. Offenses were not a crime, but a civil infraction, so you ended up in traffic court. Unless you get into something like, you get in traffic court, but you get a driving under influence, then we are going into another level where your vehicle becomes a weapon. And so now we're getting to the point of where you can be convicted of a felony. Gun control. One of the hardest issues because of the Second Amendment and the argument about bearing firearms and what was intended. I teach a course in constitutional law, and there is one lecture that's all about the Second Amendment, and I go into it in detail. But the bottom line is that guns are used in violent crimes. It says more than 300,000 were committed in 2008. Well, that number has escalated since that time. And so the issue that people are fighting is saying, oh, we got to protect ourselves. And the fact of the matter is that firearms, guns, they end up in the wrong hands, even those that are legally purchased. Sometimes people allow themselves to be used as straw people. They will purchase the gun. They don't have a criminal record, and they ultimately end up in a crime involving a shooting. And many of the gangs now have resorted to utilizing guns and some of the high-powered weapons. They were on the news just today or yesterday talking about that. And every day in Chicago, there was an issue about someone being shot. Anyway, so the issue about gun control, the city of Chicago passed laws that said that if you have a gun in Chicago, even if it's registered, that it was a violation of law, but the courts did away with that, as they also tried it in D.C. You'll see in a few minutes. But anyway, so the question about guns, people who are mentally ill, who have a felony record, are excluded from this right. Now, the issue of mentally ill, my understanding, and I haven't looked at it, is that the current president, Mr. Trump, has said that people who are mentally ill have a right to guns. And it did away with that requirement, which I think is ridiculous. And the fact that we have people who, you're going to allow a mentally ill person to get a gun. Now, a person who has a felony record is excluded from that right, so far anyway. State and federal laws have the right to impose regulation laws, background checks. Then they got the concealed weapons, and now every jurisdiction, including Illinois, which was the last to have carry concealed, then there's some carry open laws. The fact of the matter is that guns are legally carried quite frequently in our day and time based on the court's application of the Second Amendment. And one of the reasons why the courts are so strong with it, and the legislators are hard-pressed to attack it on the federal level especially, is because the most powerful lobbying organization in the United States is the NRA, the National Rifle Association. In 2012, this person went on a rampage, killing 26 at Sandy Hook in Connecticut. The victims included his own mother, 20 children, and 6 teachers and administrators. After the incident, many Americans feel like they armed themselves, again, for self-protection. Again, there has been no change in it, and in fact, it's been demonstrated that the presence of people having legal firearms doesn't change very much. Okay. Then let's go to the next one. Offenses against national security. So we start to move towards the time where we are now. Back in the sometime before treason, the crime of making war against one's own country or government, giving aid to enemies, no one's been convicted of treason since World War II. However, there are some things that are taking place as I speak now that involve the Russian government, and the jury is still out on that, so we don't know what's going to happen. But here's the key, is that our enemies should not be catered to, particularly if you have a national security clearance and you're distributing or sharing government secrets. Espionage is the crime of turning over secrets to foreign government. Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1982 was passed to deal with that issue. Again, we've had some of those. We had a situation where a military guy, pretty high up in the Navy, I believe it was, recently was convicted of doing that. And then there's a guy by the name of Edward Snowden who left the United States and sought asylum in a country where he could not be extradited from, dealing with this issue as well. So national security is a big issue now. So big that we're going to come in a few minutes, that resulted in the Patriot Act, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Sabotage, the crime of infiltrating, destroying your country's war-making capabilities. Usually this takes place during a war or national emergency. There's a 30-year mandatory prison sentence for that. Sedition, the crime of advocating or working towards the overthrow of the government. That's not advocating a political position, but it's actually putting yourself in a position, kind of like what happens with these individuals who are dealing with Al-Qaeda and dealing with the other organizations that are against the United States. Terrorism is a crime that we deal with today quite frequently, as I said, inflicting terror on the population by indiscriminate killing of people, destruction of property, often with explosive devices. I gave you some examples of those earlier. Anti-terrorism and the effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 expanded the federal jurisdiction with respect to investigation and prosecution. And this came after the Oklahoma City bombing, in which one of the suspects, who was actually, by the way, not foreign born, but born in the United States, lived in the United States, actually carried out this activity and resulted in the death of masses of people, including children. And as a result, one of them was convicted and killed with the death penalty. The other has a natural life sentence. Now we come to the Patriot Act. As I said earlier, came after the Terrorist Act of September 11th, 9/11, and prohibits supporting terrorist organizations inside and outside. That is how we now deal with many individuals that you hear in the United States who are in some form supporting financially or either advocating or preparing themselves. They have websites or they have training that supports terrorist activities that could take place foreign and domestic. Racketeering and fraud in connection with certain cyber crimes, because of the fact that we have the internet involved now and its use, possession of biological weapons, anthrax, and things of that nature. We had one of those issues some years ago. We had a gentleman who was from Elmhurst. I can't remember his name, but he was an individual who was a scientist and he created some of these biological weapons. Allows for civil forfeiture and for secret warrants and searches. Some things that would ordinarily provide the Fourth Amendment protection are drawn back in favor of the compelling government interest of protecting us from further terrorist activities and attacks. Let's go back. I think that's it. Yeah, so the next one. We're almost done here. Combating piracy, aircraft piracy, that is taking control of vehicles by force, violence, the threat of force, including civil and military aircraft. And during September 11th, that happened actually with aircraft that was supposedly being directed to crash into the Pentagon, and some did crash, but there was one that happened and resulted in the death of the people. I forget what state it was. They want to say Pennsylvania, but I'm not sure. But anyway, the bottom line is that hijacking airplanes and things of that nature. Some of the crashes that have taken place mysteriously has some investigations that involve dealing with aircraft piracy. Naval piracy is where it carries a life sentence as the maximum penalty for robberies at sea. An example of naval piracy, since 2005, off the coast of Somalia has increased. Pirates attack commercial ships, but shouldn't say shops, but ships, but also military vessels. And the pirates argue that they're protecting their own territorial waters from illegal dumping of toxic waste by commercial ships, but that's not true. They said the toxic waste destroyed the fishing grounds, and the Somali fishermen turned to piracy. But that's not necessarily true. There's an underlying factor that's involved as well. Weapons of mass destruction, you've been hearing about that for years, designed to kill large numbers of people, include nuclear, radiological, biological, and chemical weapons like the anthrax thing I was talking about there. The threat of using weapons of mass destruction is also a criminal offense because of the times that we live in now. Johnny Wise and Jack Abbott Gravy were convicted for threatening, just threatening. They didn't even actually get to the point. They sent emails to government agencies, and that's a no-no. Immigration offenses, as I speak today, there's been so many changes taking place, and there's much needed work to be done with the immigration laws. Violations of criminal provisions of the Immigration Nationality Act relate to immigration. Congress has plenary power over immigration, obviously because it's across the state lines. And most immigrants, it says at this time now, come over the southern border. Now, that speaks exactly to, why don't you just say it, it's Mexicans that they were talking about. And so that is one of the issues, that there are problems, there are people that are being deported left and right back to Mexico in various situations. There are dreamers, individuals who were brought here as babies and grew up, and then they were sent back. And then there are other individuals. So there's a whole lot of issues that are currently taking place. Our current president has decided to use executive orders, and he's using that to the point of dealing with immigration from the South, as well as immigration from some Muslim countries. And so there's been a whole lot of attacks. As you and I both know, the courts have constantly ruled them as unconstitutional and entered restraining orders. So this matter is going to continue, and it's heading toward the U.S. Supreme Court, where there is a real serious problem here because of the fact that right now the Supreme Court is 5-4, with liberals 5, and now 4 with the appointment of the justice to fulfill Scalia's position. And remember, there's no period. That's a lifetime position. But that there's one Supreme Court justice who's the oldest one, and I heard recently that she was visited by the president to try to see how she was doing, and she basically told him to get out of here, get out of my face. She knew what was going on, because the current president would have the opportunity to appoint the new justice, and then it would change the balance of power. So with the situation being as it is now, there is a chance for people who have some issues when it comes to immigration, but it's going to really be tough if it gets to the United States Supreme Court with a change. But there are political differences between Democrats and Republicans but that have created problems with trying to get this done. And it's a very sad situation that's taking place in our country, which I constantly remind people we are a country of immigrants, and we shouldn't be dealing with this problem like this. But anyway, that's it for today. I have covered everything that I need to cover. And so I am going to say good night to you. See you in 2 weeks from now with our next lecture, which will take place in 2 weeks from today. So you know how to reach me. If there are any questions or issues or problems, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to say good night.